Hi everybody, I am Nermin Hocaoğlu Bahadır from Kırklareli University. I'm going to talk today about democratic deficit in the European Union. Let me share my screen to be able to see my presentation here. And I am now starting for my presentation. Let's start with the outline of this presentation. First of all, today now I am going to talk about the European Union, the democratic deficit in the EU according to institutional perspective and the socio-psychological perspective, the solutions, recommendations for democratic deficit in the EU will be my last point. And let's start with the EU. Crises are the greatest unifier, as Jean Monnet indicated. We know that after the Second World War, the European Economic Community was founded, and it is the beginning of the European Union, which is a sui generis union. It is an unfinished project, changing day by day according to the needs of the member states. The European Economic Community was founded in 1957. Then it became European Communities in the process, and in 1982 it was named as European Union with the Maastricht Treaty. It has both intergovernmental and supranational properties. This is what makes it sui generis. It has institutions just like many other international unions and organizations. The EEC had four main institutions, and the Assembly, the Council, the Commission, the Court of Justice are some of them. Here I'm going to talk about the Assembly a little bit. Representatives were appointed from the 6 member states of the community. They were both the members of their national parliaments and the Assembly. It had deliberative and supervisory powers. It discussed the annual general report. The Assembly could also deliberate on draft budgets submitted to it and propose amendments to these budgets. It also issued opinions on some regulations. And today's European Parliament, the Assembly became European Parliament in 1962. The members of the European Parliament have been directly elected since 1979. The last election was last year in 2019. There are 705 members in the Parliament today because as we all know, there are 27 member states in the European Union. The Parliament has a legislative power. Its responsibilities, duties, and power have increased since the beginning. With each treaty, the power and the jurisdiction of the European Parliament have been increased. Today, the European Parliament is one of the decision-making institutions of the EU. Citizens of the EU are voting for the Parliament. The turnout of European elections were falling after the first election. The turnout for the first one was 62%, and then the last one was nearly 51%. So we can say that there is a decreasing process. But we should also note that the previous ones were about 40%. So the last year's turnout was better than the others, but the first one was the best. Okay. Let's look what is democratic deficit. The EU has been criticized for many different issues. One of them is its lack of democratic legitimation, or in other words, its democratic deficit. According to Marcus Hurt, the forced transfer of political decisions and allocations from the national to European level has weakened democratic influence and control. But before focusing on democratic deficit, we should look at what is democracy. And democracy is generally defined as a form of government in which all adult citizens have an equal say in the decisions that affect their lives. And the word comes from Greek. Its origin is Greek, and the Greek version is demokratia. It consists of two words, demos and kratos. Demos means people, and kratos rule, and the combination means the rule of people. So here, people has the power. Okay, what is democratic deficit? Lord defines it as decisions in the EU are in some ways insufficiently representative of or accountable to the notions and people of Europe. McCormick, the gap between the powers held by the European institutions and the ability of European citizens to influence the work and decisions of those institutions. Christophe, the growing dissonance between the requirements of modern democratic rule and the actual conditions upon which the governance of the EU is based. These are some of the definitions of the democratic deficit. And Demetrius assessed democratic deficit according to institutional and socio-psychological perspectives. In institutional perspective, it is focused on EU institutions, institutional power sharing, institutional decision making. And in socio-psychological perspective, it is focused on European civic identity and European demos formation. Institutional perspective, the concern here is on transfer of power from national parliaments to European institutions, increase of qualified majority voting, growing role of European executive. In the EU, democratic deficit occurs in the lack of accountability of the EU institutions, in the absence of representative and direct democracy. The citizens of the EU do not participate enough in the decision-making process directly. They just have a direct say in the election of the EP, and they don't generally prefer to vote in these elections. We should note it because, as we have seen in the last in the last elections, just half of the citizens of the European Union voted for the European Parliament. According to the institutional perspective, democratic deficit is assessed in relation with the EU institutions such as the EP, European Parliament, the European Council, the Commission, the European Court of Justice, but the most emphasis is on the EP and national parliaments, as I have mentioned before, and it is criticized, and the EP is criticized to be weak, but its power has been increased since the mid-1980s. The European Commission is criticized for being an undemocratic institution as it is composed of appointed members who possess of substantive policy-making powers. The European Court of Justice is criticized for its theological pro-integralist bias. The Council is criticized for having the final say in the crucial legislative matters and is also criticized for being secretive and arcane body. What are the solutions for this? Recognizing the union's institutional balance, giving more power to the EP as a representative body, increasing EP's power to scrutinize Commission, bringing EU closer to its citizens, increasing public participation, increasing transparency and simplification, strengthening representation of regions and localities, increasing the role of national parliaments, providing institutional openness are some of these solutions. When we look to the socio-psychological perspective, we can say that the democratic deficit occurs because of the absence of European demos, people. According to Critical, the transformation of the EU from democracies to the democracy required the positive feelings of the member publics to be stronger than any device issues that may arise as integration proceeds. So the important point is to come together to be whole, not to be separated with national identities, but to have a European identity. It is important to provide a feeling of belonging to the whole, but this is not easy because in EU, 91% of all citizens feel attached to their own country, while only 53% of them feel attached to the EU. This shows how difficult it is to construct European identity. Most of the European citizens attach to their national identities and they still haven't accepted themselves as just European. European identity is important for viability of EU democracy. To provide a European identity, there should be awareness. The members should recognize their collective existence. They should feel European. But this kind of awareness or recognition does not mean assimilation or assimilating national identities. It means coming together to be part of a democratic whole. Constructing democratic EU is closely related with forming EU demos because absence of demos is seen as barrier in creating democratic EU. Solutions for democratic deficit. To find a solution for the democratic deficit, it should be noted what kind of governance model we are talking about. In terms of EU, as a sui generis international organization, constitutional and republican models can be more appropriate. The key features of the constitution and grand coalition: proportionality, segmental autonomy, and mutual vetoes. We can see these features in the EU, closed council meetings, voting, distinct jurisdiction for separate policies, and vetoes. In Republican model, there are three objectives: justice to the rule of law, common good through constitution, liberty achieved through active citizenship. The democracy in the EU was also tried to be provided with the treaties such as Maastricht Treaty, the Amsterdam Treaty, Treaty of Nice, the Constitutional Treaty, and the Lisbon Treaty. The democratization of EU has been an improving process, but the process has not been completed yet. Still, there are reforms to be made. So even if some improvements have been succeeded, it is not enough. So, as a conclusion, democratic deficit is one of the most criticized issues in the EU. There are many definitions of democratic deficit. However, in general, it is defined as the lack of democracy and lack of representativeness of the European citizens. Solutions encouraging the role of EP is important. Constructing European demos and identity is also really important in this process. There is much to do for democratization of the EU, and there is not an agreed solution for resolving democratic deficit. There is not just one way to activate the process to get results. For that reason, different perspectives should be used. The current state of the EU is not an end state. The process is improving. The creation of EU demos, the improvements in the EU structures and functioning, and the transition to a participatory form of polity may be the reforms in the future. And thank you for listening to me. Now I'm stopping to share the screen. I hope you enjoy my presentation. Thank you again. See you.